Hey, thank you for joining us at Prophecy in the News. I'm your host, Kevin Clarkson. We appreciate this chance to come into your home and share with you about the Lord. Frank Turek is our guest for the second of two programs. He is an author. He speaks to college campuses, to churches around the nation, really giving a strong case for Christianity and the truths of the gospel. We're living in a greater age of skepticism than I can remember in my lifetime, and it's more needed than ever that we be able to give voice to the truth.
Absolutely, Kevin. Thanks for having me on again.
You betcha. You know, we're showcasing a couple of books that you've authored. One, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. We didn't even comment on that title last time, but
Yeah.
would you just kind of elaborate on that title? Just,
It's obviously a play on words.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know, the common definition of faith, it's not the definition of the Bible, but the common definition of faith is something you have in spite of the evidence. You know,
Right.
You don't have any evidence, so you just have faith. And so we were using that as a play to say, look, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist because there's so little evidence for atheism. You got to have a lot of faith to be an atheist. You don't have to have a lot of faith to be a Christian because there's a lot of evidence for
That's
Christianity.
where it stacks up. That's
yeah.
right.
So it was kind of
Yeah.
a play. And when I tell that to people, you know, what's the name of your book? I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Most people laugh. They go, oh, that's good. That's
It is good. I remember the first time I heard it. Well, it reminds me of the little boy that came home, and this is the problem. He comes home from Sunday school. His dad doesn't ever take him. His dad sits home every Sunday. But he says, well, son, what'd you learn? He said, well, I learned about faith. And the dad said, well, what is faith? He said, well, Dad, best I got it, faith is believing something you know ain't so. You think about that a minute. I've had many young people tell me that have really struggled later in college when their faith was challenged. They came to church with honest questions, and they were just told, well, you just got to believe.
Yeah, that's awful. In fact,
that does more harm than good,
no,
I think.
in fact, that's basically what Katy Perry was told. You know, the pop star?
Yeah.
She was a daughter of a Pentecostal minister, and she just did this big, long interview on YouTube. In fact, we did a radio program on it.
I didn't hear it, but I heard snaps.
Yeah, and she was just saying, I was told I really couldn't ask questions. And I'm thinking, I don't blame her for walking away.
Well, yeah.
She couldn't ask questions. You know, no, faith does not mean believe in what you know ain't so. Faith, the word actually means trust. And it means to trust in Christ. In fact, there's two kinds of faith. There's belief that, and then there's belief in. Belief that is getting evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Bible is true. That's what we do in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, in the book Stealing from God, which is right behind me right now. Where is it? Right there.
Yeah.
We give evidence that it's true.
Right.
But all the belief that in the world won't get your moral transgressions forgiven. Even James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote that little book in the New Testament called James, says even the demons believe that God exists, but they tremble. Yeah, they know intellectually better than we do that God exists.
And they're emotional about it.
That's right.
But the faith you're talking, the second is a relational
Yes,
word.
it's belief in. It's belief in.
And that's what John's gospel uses, believe in, believe in.
Exactly. And most of the time when the Bible's talking about faith, it's talking about the second kind, believe in. After you know that it's true, trust in Jesus. It doesn't mean blind faith,
Right.
quite the contrary. After you know that it's true, trust in it. And we know this from relationships. Like, for example, when I first met my wife 31 years ago, I got evidence that she would be a good wife, but all the evidence in the world didn't make her my wife. I had to
Right.
take a step of trust in her to ask her to be my wife. And in a momentary lapse of judgment, she said yes.
I think
See?
she had a greater trust
That's right.
than you did. No.
That's right.
Well, see, that's what your ministry and many others is about. You're helping believing about or that so that they can come to a belief in.
Exactly. Yep.
And many people in our churches haven't really nailed the first part down. They maybe have really put their trust in Jesus in a, I hate to say a childish way, because Jesus said have faith like a child, and it's okay to just come and trust. But honestly, the hardwired world we're living in with constant attacks on our faith intellectually, I think we need to make Christians thinking Christians.
Exactly. And when Jesus said have a childlike faith, what he meant was trust in God like a child would trust in a parent. Doesn't mean that there's no evidence, you don't have any evidence that God exists or that Jesus is the Savior. You do. But once you know it's true, then trust in him like a child would trust in a parent.
It's not a simplistic just no, but it's
Not
a
at all.
sweet relational trust.
Exactly.
Well, this other book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. Let's kind of explore what drove you to author this second book. What did you begin to find some other questions as you went out and you were having a lot of conversations and presentations? Did you see these other issues arising?
Yeah, what I've seen was, and by the way, the book's not about tithing. Stealing
Yeah.
from God's not about tithing. The subtitle is Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. And I've noticed that atheists are stealing aspects of reality from God in order to say God doesn't exist. In other words, the things that they use to say God doesn't exist wouldn't exist unless God existed.
Right.
Putting it in another way, what if your best arguments to doubt God show that he actually exists? That's really kind of the thesis of the book. And one of the topics I take up in the book, Stealing from God, is the topic of evil. Because you hear,
Sure.
there can't be a good God if there's too much evil in the world. And what it turns out when atheists say that is they're actually stealing from God in order to say God doesn't exist. You say, how so? Because evil wouldn't exist unless good existed, and good wouldn't exist unless God existed, because by definition, God is what we mean by good. His nature is what goodness is. But evil wouldn't exist unless goodness exists, because evil doesn't exist on its own. It only exists as a lack in good. For example, evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of the car, you got a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, you got nothing, right? So evil is like that. It's real, but it only exists as a privation or a defect in good.
Okay.
So if you're going to say something's evil, as atheists do, and we all believe things are evil, then there has to be a standard of good by which we'd even know what evil was. But if good exists, then God exists. So evil doesn't disprove God.
Amen.
It may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God, because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. So when atheists are saying something is unjust or immoral or not right, they're assuming something is just or moral or right, which means God exists. So evil doesn't disprove God. It shows there's a devil, but it doesn't disprove God, because evil wouldn't exist unless good existed, and good wouldn't exist unless God existed. So what I'm saying here is they're stealing from God by claiming he doesn't exist because there's evil in the world.
Right, right. I even found, for those that are interested in, the roots of words, our word God and the English word Gott, the German word Gott, they come from the adjective good. It's like you put a capital G on it. The greatest,
excellent.
ultimate good
I didn't know that.
is
That's
God.
good. Yeah.
And of course, that's not his name. Let's remind ourselves.
Right.
God has a name he's revealed himself by, and we pronounce it Jehovah, but Jesus ultimately he became man. But God is like the title president. It's his office. But he is the ultimate good.
Right.
The guy comes up to Jesus and he says, "What good thing must I do?" And Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? There's none good but God." And Jesus wasn't denying his goodness; he was affirming his godness.
Exactly. Yeah, he's saying, "All right, don't you recognize the implications of what you're saying? You're calling me good, and no one's good but God." And that's a great section there, Kevin, I think, to disabuse people of the notion when they say, "Well, I'm a good person."
Yeah.
You say, "Well, no, you're not. I mean, you may be better than your neighbor, but you're still evil, just like I am. There's only one good, and that's God."
Well, that's just what you said about the rust in the car. Our good is still such a imperfection and defect on the utter holiness of God. Well, thinking about these concepts of stealing from God, let's wade in a little bit. You talked about, we'll get back to evil, but what about causality? When you talk about cause?
Yes. In fact, there's an acronym in the book that the book goes through. It's CRIMES, C-R-I-M-E-S. And the C stands for causality, the R reason, the I information and intentionality, the M morality, E evil, and S science. And what I'm saying is each one of those things, causality, reason, information, morality, evil, and science, are often things that atheists point to say there's no God, when in fact none of those things would exist unless God existed. So they're stealing from God to argue against him. For example, on causality, atheists will say, whenever they think an argument points away from God, the law of causality, like subsequent life forms came through some sort of evolutionary process. They go, "Yep, that's it. See, God doesn't exist. We don't need God for subsequent life forms." But as soon as the law of causality points to a argument which seems like God does exist, which points to God, like, for example, the beginning of the universe.
Right.
That space, matter, and time had a beginning, so the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, all these things we talked about in the last program. As soon as that happens, they go, "Wait a minute, we're not sure if this law of causality really applies," right? Maybe the universe popped into existence without a cause. Well, look, you can't have it both ways, right?
No, you can't.
Either things have a cause or they don't. If they have a cause, then let's find out what the cause is. If they don't have a cause, you can't do science. Why? Because science is a search for causes. That's what you're doing when you're trying to find causes. So ultimately, all causes are caused primarily by the great mind who created the universe and created the natural laws that dictate the universe, or that how the universe runs naturally, and that being that created those laws and created and sustains the universe and those laws is the being we call God. So causality ultimately resides in what Aristotle would call an unmoved mover, and what Aquinas later called God. That being is really responsible for the cause and effect we see in the universe ultimately. Now, agents can be secondary causes. We're agents. We can do cause and effect. But our ability to do cause and effect relies on this natural world, which is held together by the ultimate cause, God. So when atheists try and use causality to say God doesn't exist, they're actually stealing from God, because causality wouldn't even apply unless there was a being who created the universe and created all these laws which allow these things to happen.
All right, good. I don't know if we can talk about all those things, but let's track down information.
Yeah.
And you put intentionality with that.
Yeah.
Did they work together, or just
both
start with I? So
the information there is the idea that, say, a cell, and Darwin never knew this when he was studying evolution, or when he was studying life forms. In the simplest of cells we know, say a one-celled amoeba, you have the amount of information that would fill 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia in a microscopic little cell. Now, what's information? Information is like a message, like prophecy in the news, right there, .com. That's information. Natural laws could never create that. Right? We know that prophecyinthenews.com is a message that only can come from a mind. Well, DNA in a living thing is like prophecy in the news. It's just a lot longer, right?
A lot longer.
So if prophecy in the news requires a mind, then an information segment 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia long also require a mind. What mind? Well, the great mind, in my view. It's got to be some being that imbued living things with that kind of information. So that's one argument we make, that there's got to be an intelligence out there. Because if intelligence is required for a message like prophecy in the news, then intelligence is required for something a lot longer.
Yeah. Information is an amazing thing, and it even seems to be there in just in the facts of Genesis chapter 1. That God is letting things create after their kind.
Yes.
And there's no deviation.
Yes. Yes. There's a little adaptation, but they don't become other.
They don't become other cross lines of species.
And as John says in the beginning of the Gospel of John, he says, in the beginning was the Word. Well, that word logos is where we get the word logic from. The ultimate reality is a mind, God, the logos.
Right.
And he created all things, and the Word became flesh. So the Word actually came into this time-space continuum and added flesh over his deity and became our sacrifice.
And that's the greatest mystery of all.
Yes.
It says that in 1 Timothy 3:16, by the way, because I was just teaching on that passage, and it says the mystery of the faith earlier in the chapter, and then he calls it the mystery of godliness. How godliness is actually brought to us. God was manifested in the flesh. And he came in the flesh.
That's right.
You'll never wrap your head around that, but that'll change your life.
That's true.
Amen.
Yeah, that's right.
Amen. Well, let's talk about maybe the idea of morality. You've got an idea of an argument, and I referenced last time, I've seen you in a setting where you allow questions and answers, and somebody actually assumed to stand in judgment upon God. If there were a God, they would reject him, they said, because they weren't saying it, but they were actually assuming that they were morally superior to God.
That's right. If there is no God, there's no ultimate right or wrong, because, again, God is the ultimate standard of goodness. If goodness doesn't exist, then you can't say something's good or evil. There can't be any deviation from something if it doesn't exist. So if there's just one thing morally wrong out there, just one, like say it's wrong to torture babies for fun, well, there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no standard beyond us, then that's just your opinion against a baby torturer's opinion.
Right.
Right? Or you couldn't say that the Holocaust was really wrong. That's just your opinion against Hitler's opinion. So there's got to be a standard beyond humanity. Well, naturalism can't give us that standard. If we're just molecules in motion,
Right.
if we're just molecular machines, if there's nothing immaterial, like justice or goodness, then you can't say anything's right or wrong. Well, we all know certain things are right or wrong. Well, if certain things are right and wrong, then God exists because he's the standard of right, the standard of goodness. So that's the argument we make in the morality chapter. In the reason chapter, let me mention one thing about
Sure.
this, because this is important, I think, when it comes to atheists. They'll say we're the reasonable ones, we're the logical ones, we're beacons of reason and all these things. The problem is, by their own worldview, Kevin, they don't believe in any immaterial realm. Most atheists today are materialists. They think everything's made of molecules, right? Here's the problem for them. They will say that every thought I have is the result of the laws of physics, because I'm just a moist robot. I'm just a meat machine, right? I'm just a molecular machine, and every thought I have is the result of the laws of physics. Well, if that's the case, why should I believe anything you think then?
That's right.
Why should I believe that theory right there, that you're saying you're just a molecular machine? Why should I believe that? You didn't reason to that conclusion. The laws of physics brought you there, see? So, ironically, the people who claim they're beacons of reason have made reason impossible by their own theory, by their own ideology of materialism. Unless the mind and the brain are distinct, that there's a mind, and you're not just a brain, then you can't know anything.
Right.
You're no different than a Coke can fizzing.
You're more than a circuitry of electrons moving inside of gray matter.
Exactly.
And it's the ghost in the machine, as it's been called, but the idea of, the Bible speaks of our spirit.
That's right.
Made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm. We are, and that means we have the ability to make choices, because we have a mind, not just a brain. We have the ability to make choices, and they're not dictated by the laws of physics, which means we have moral responsibility for what we do, and which means we can make a choice to follow or not follow God, given his Holy Spirit comes and pursues us. We can either choose to accept it or we can reject it. If we're molecular machines, then how can we blame anybody for anything they do? In fact, Richard Dawkins says, we just dance to our DNA. Richard Dawkins, the atheist. Well, if we dance to our DNA, how can you blame a murderer or a rapist for doing what they do? They're just dancing to their DNA. They don't have any choice in that.
Well, we'll be there before long.
We'll be where?
We'll be there before long, saying people are born with these
dispositions.
We've already allowed that for certain sexual
That's true.
behaviors.
Yeah.
And although they're backing up, and I don't want to wade into it too much, but you mentioned earlier Katy Perry. Mm-hmm. Another Lady Gaga had the anthem "Born That Way."
Sure, yeah.
And everybody ran and championed that as saying, I'm made this way. But now that we have the gender fluid scale, we don't want to be born that way.
Yeah, 10 minutes ago they were telling us we're born that way. Now you're saying you can wake up as a man and go to bed as a woman.
Exactly.
You know? Well, you can't have it both ways, you know?
Well, that's a smack in the face of reality. And let's think about that. Again, Romans 1, we deny God, we're going to end up denying truth, and ultimately we deny reality that stares us in the face.
And the reason we do that is because we want to get something for ourselves that we think we need, and God is in the way. So we suppress the truth about God to get our own way. And that's why Paul says we suppress the truth and unrighteousness. That's why Jesus says men love darkness rather than light.
Because their deeds are
And
evil.
the tragedy of all that, Kevin, is, and we're old enough to know this, maybe some of our listeners aren't, the only way to get true contentment and happiness is to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. Right? We all want to try it our own way, right? We all want to say, I don't need God, I can do my own thing. If I do this, this, and this, I'll be happy. Well, we try this, this, and this. We get temporary happiness, long-term pain and suffering.
Right.
The only way to get true contentment and happiness is to go straight through truth, and Jesus is the truth. But we don't want to try that way. We want to do our own thing. We want to be God. We don't want there to be a God.
That's so powerful. Well, let's come back to evil. Let me just offer the books, and then we'll talk about evil in a minute. We've been talking with Frank Turek, and Frank is used of God in a lot of ways. He equips Christians and students going off to school to be able to combat and take a stand for their faith. And he's got a couple of great books that we're offering at Prophecy in the News. The first one, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And that's got some great content. It deals with really 4 questions we answer about the proof of Christianity. And then the one we're discussing now, Stealing from God, and the fact that if anyone's going to try to disprove God, they have to take reality as God made it to try to even make their case. And you can go to our website or call the 800 number on your screen and find the ordering information there. But you'll enjoy these. And for somebody that thinks that we're talking along a line that seems a little philosophical, and I know when we get out into cause and some of those things, maybe that is a little bit out there for some people. But when we come to evil, I think everybody can identify pretty quickly because, you know, I'm a pastor, and I've over the years found that the greatest things people wrestle with are suffering that seems to have no sense or explanation to them.
Yes, and when they're going through that, they need someone like you, not somebody like me. They need a pastor, not
They
a
don't need
philosopher.
this right then, yeah.
They need comfort.
That's very true. But the day comes that then they can process
That's right.
that.
And we have a whole chapter on evil in the book, but we already mentioned that it doesn't disprove God. In fact, if evil exists, God exists, because evil is only possible if good is there, and good is only possible if God exists. But the question still remains, why would God allow evil to continue? And this is
that's where I was really getting to.
Yes.
Yeah, why this dress rehearsal for eternity?
Right.
Why is this continuing to play out?
Yes, there's a lot of reasons, and a lot of times it builds us up because we can't learn compassion unless someone's suffering, and we can't learn faith unless we have a need, and we can't learn courage unless there's danger, you know, these kinds of things. But also there's a ripple effect, and this is the one insight that I learned in researching for this topic that really helped me, because I would look at say a baby dying or something, and you go, I can't see any good coming out of that. And it's true, I can't. But it's because I'm limited. See, God is unlimited. He's outside of time. We're inside of time.
Right.
And that event, say a baby dying today, may ripple forward and in some way affect trillions of other events, one of which might be that 500 years from now, some great evangelist rises up partially because of that baby dying today, who then goes to save millions of people. We can't trace all that. We can't trace all those ripples, but God can. He's outside of time. He can see it. This is kind of the theme of the book of Job. Job, I know you can't understand all this, but trust me, it's going to work out in the end. You may never see it, but I'm outside of time. I can see the end from the beginning. Sometimes you do see the ripple effect. In fact, in Genesis 50, you see it. When Joseph, Joseph of the Old Testament is sold into slavery by his brothers, he rises to prominence in Egypt, and when his family flees Israel to flee a famine, they go to Egypt, where Joseph has risen to prominence in Egypt, and he's there to save them from the famine, even though they tried to kill him.
Right.
They sold him into slavery. So what does Joseph say in Genesis 50:20? He says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, the saving of many lives right now." So there, the ripple effect you could see in Joseph's own lifetime.
In a generation.
In a generation. We don't always see it, but there you can see it. And so we can't see how it happens, when it happens. Sometimes we can, but most of the time we can't. So we trust in God, because everything that happens is connected to everything else.
I know you pointed to me as a pastor, and one of the things that has meant a lot in my life is Romans 8:28. And a lot of you will know that verse.
Yes.
We know. There are some things we can know. We're confident.
That's right.
That God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And we do trust in that.
Yes.
And we do see that. And I've had to stand by people at times of grief, times of loss and tragedy. And the thing that I've seen is that, you know, in those moments, answers would never comfort the heart anyway. That's why we need our faith. It's for what we don't understand that we have to trust at that moment.
Not only that, but in that famous verse you mentioned there, it doesn't say all things are good.
No.
It says all things work together
right.
for good.
And some translations say God works all things. So
yes.
You know, there's his force behind it.
Yes. And I mean, sometimes, I don't know how much time we have, but turned out I was doing a session on If God, Why Evil at the University of Michigan, or actually Michigan State. And very briefly, a guy was arguing over, you know, there can't be a good guy because there's too much evil in the world, and this ripple effect doesn't do anything for me. And just then a guy next to him raised his hand, and he said, I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I know of a woman who was raped. The rape nearly destroyed her, but she decided she wasn't going to punish the baby for the sin of the father," and his voice began to crack. And then he said, this young boy grew up to be a man who actually became a pastor. And by this time, he's crying in front of everybody.
Wow.
Right there in Michigan State. He said, this man grew up to be a pastor who has brought many people to Christ and has discipled many people and comforted many people. And he said, that man grew up to be me.
Wow.
And he looked over at the atheist who I was arguing with over this, and he goes, if my mom can bring good from evil, so can God.
Wow. That silenced the room.
Yeah, I said, you're dismissed. I mean, what else could I say, right?
Yes.
Here's an instance of it happening, and he sees it. He was born of rape, yet now he's led many people to Christ. And she brought good from evil. If she can do it, can God do it? Of course.
We are speaking all about these great issues, and you know, Frank, for me, it comes down to the fact that God did give. He gave us choice, and where there's choice, there has to be the outcomes of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it was no risk. God knew what would happen, but He, from the foundation of the eternity, ordained that Christ would come and solve the problem.
And that's the greatest evil.
That's
that
right.
Jesus, an innocent person, took evil on himself so we could be free from it ultimately.
You're exactly right. The greatest injustice of all.
That's right.
The Son of God did when He was crucified. And God took the worst thing that we could ever do to Him, and He transformed it into the best thing He could ever do to us. That's an amazing thing.
That's right. There's
God's an amazing God.
turning evil into good right there.
And yeah, and we may think that this stuff is really heady and philosophical, but honestly, when you get in the heart of God, the heart of the gospel, the only response that I have is to worship. God is so worthy, and He's so great. Well, if you had a word for families or individuals that are wrestling with any doubts, just in a quick summation, what would you tell them?
I would say that your doubts can drive you to get answers, and that's a good thing. But secondly, your doubts don't affect the truth of Christianity.
That's right.
If God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, you can doubt it all day. It's still true. Conversely, you can believe it all day. If it didn't happen, it's not true. So don't concentrate on your doubts. Concentrate on the evidence, because the evidence will show you whether it's true or not. And if it's true, mark it down. It's true, and you should start doubting your doubts. By the way, if you start doubting your doubts, then you're back to knowing something for sure.
That's right. I think, therefore I know. I can't doubt that there's a doubt
right.
doubting. Well, that's great. I want to thank you for being with us today, and as always, we want to remind you that you can bring all your questions to God. He's not offended by your questions. As long as you're honest with Him, as long as you're sincere and genuine, you can ask Him anything. He can take it. He has answers. They're in the Word of God, and Jesus Christ will be your greatest answer. We want you to trust Him. Until then, we're going to keep looking up. Thank you.